I love that clip. And you know, the first time I saw that movie, I didn't love that clip because I didn't get it. But I am a father since the first time I've seen that, and I have a daughter. And I love if you watch Steve Martin's face, how he's chewing his dinner until she starts talking, and he goes still until things get really serious. And he starts chewing again. And as you watch him, you just see the emotions that a father has when major events happen in the life of his child, because he loves her so much, but also because he remembers her. You know, he remembers her when she was little. He remembers her when she needed everything from him, when she needed to hold his hand crossing the street, when she would probably climb into their bed because she was afraid of things at night. You know, this is the memory that a father has that goes into the way that he cares about his children. And you know, this weekend we are celebrating Father's Day. And I love what Craig was saying, because for some of us, you know, Father's Day is a lot of fun. You know, we celebrate, we cook out, we get really spiffy neckties from our kids, right? But for some of us, it's a little more painful. It may be that you didn't have a good relationship with your dad. It may be that you don't have a good relationship with your kids or your grandkids. You know, it could be that this is the first Father's Day that you have faced without your dad. You know, I don't know which of those it might be for you, but what's really fascinating about Father's Day that we get to slow down and reflect on a little bit is that for all the different kinds of fathers in the world, all of the different relationships that we have, and how confusing that can sometimes be as the roles of fathers change in culture and in society and over time, we have a God who wants to know us as our Father. He wants us to be His children and to call Him Father. And I think there's so many ways that word and that relationship can get mixed up in our lives. How interesting that God still uses that to relate to us. And so this morning we're going to explore that a little bit. Because if God is Father, then He must be the perfect dad. And you know, when you think of the perfect dad, maybe you think of things like provider, protector, unconditional love, a teacher who is tough but fair, somebody patient, sacrificial, who always respects and honors mom, always loves and honors the kids. Or maybe you had like the playground version of this. My dad can beat up your dad. Yeah, well, my dad is smarter than your dad. Come on, tell me I'm not the only one here who had that argument in third grade, right? You know, the perfect dad is like Joe Montana in the backyard, Michael Jordan in the driveway, Nolan Ryan at the field down the street. He's Superman when you need a hero. And he's Steve Martin in Father of the Bride when you need a friend. And I'll bet you nobody in this room is the perfect dad. I know I'm not. But we have a God who wants to relate to us as the perfect dad, as a father who loves us. And so this morning, as we explore what the perfect dad is really like, it's going to give you a chance to grow as a father by knowing the Father. Now, I know not everybody in this room is a father for different reasons. Some of them may be as simple as gender. But this morning is an opportunity to understand if you are a father, whether you have young kids, teenage kids, adult children, grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren, how you can grow as a father by knowing the Father. And we're going to look at 3 qualities of the perfect dad that help us do that as fathers, but also for all of us in the way that we know God as Father. And the first quality is this: the perfect dad loves you because he remembers who you are. The perfect dad loves you because he remembers who you are. You know, just like that video we just saw from Father of the Bride. You know, everything that happens next in the movie is because he loves his daughter. You know, whether they disagree or whether he helps her out, whether he shows her compassion, whether he tries to change her mind, it's all because deep in his heart he has a love for her because he remembers her, that she belongs to him. You know, I think about this a little bit in my own family because there are times where, as our kids have been growing, we don't have 2-year-olds anymore. Thank goodness. But there are times that you are just butting heads with like a 2-year-old. And you just cannot see the end of this fight. And no matter how much logic or reason or explanation you give, they're still just screaming about something. And for me, there was just all these moments where my wife would walk in and say, remember, he's 2. Right? Remember, you love him. Right. I forgot that for just a minute. I do. I love him. I love him because he's mine. Because he's my son. Father's Day is celebrated in a lot of different ways around the world. I did a little bit of research on this week. Because a lot of times here as fathers, we do a cookout, maybe we do the giving of gifts, and a lot of countries do it that way, but there's a few that do it different. One of them I thought was pretty neat is in Germany, at least they used to do this. What you would do was you would fill a cart with all of your children. And then instead of having a horse pull it, you put it on Dad's shoulders, and Dad pulls the cart to the middle of town, and whoever has the most kids wins a big piece of ham. Is that not awesome? I have 4 kids. I should be able to get at least a little bit of ham, right? What a crazy tradition. But one of the ones that I thought was the coolest was in Australia. I guess one of the main things that they do in Australia as they celebrate Father's Day is that families will sit down and look through photo albums together. Maybe they do the cookout, maybe they do the gifts, but they sit down and remember together the relationship that they've had, the experiences that they've had. And God does this too. In fact, it shows us in Psalm 103 how God, as the perfect dad, loves us because he remembers who we are. And I love this psalm. It's one of the psalms that has helped me understand how to relate to my God as my Father more than any other. And the whole psalm is worth probably your time, maybe your memorization. But I want to show you 2 verses in the middle of it right here. In verses 13 and 14, it says, as a father pities his children. And you've got to know, the word that's used there is not pity like just feel bad for something. It's really this idea of having compassion on. You could read it as a father has compassion on his children. So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. See, remembering is relational. This moment for God, if he remembers that we're dust, what that means is God can remember back to before time began. He can remember in the Garden of Eden when he scooped dust from the earth to form, literally, the first man. He knows how each and every one of you have been created carefully in his hands from that same kind of dust. And that means he also knows our weaknesses. He knows every mistake we've ever made, every failure we've ever had, everything that we've ever done that hurt somebody else or hurt us. Everything that's ever happened to us where somebody else hurt us. He remembers. He remembers that we are dust, and he remembers that things can get dusty because he has that shared experience with us. If you are a father or a mother, you never forget that first moment when you hold your child, when you bring your child home for the first time. These things are unforgettable, and for years after that, there are times when you're facing conflict with that child, when you're trying to teach them or coach them or build them up, and you remember back to those days when they were so little. I stumbled across a picture of our family the other day when our littlest guy had just been born. Our daughter was not quite 4, our twins were not quite 2, and we had this brand new baby, and it's a picture of us in the hospital, and all of the other children just have these dumbfounded looks on their faces, what is this baby doing here? But as soon as I saw that picture, it was whatever happens in any of your lives, I will be there for you. You just feel that, and that's what God feels for us because he remembers. He remembers who we are. And there's another concept in here that's interesting because there's this word fear, that he has compassion on those who fear him. A lot of times we don't understand that word, and it threatens to create distance in our relationship with God. Because often we think of fear as just being scared. If I was in the woods and I saw a bear, I would be scared. I would distance myself from the bear. But it's different with God. You see, the way that this talks about fear, the idea is that this is a recognition of who God is, a recognition of God's authority, that we revere him, we honor him. We fear him because we know that part of God's role as our Father is to make sure that he corrects wrong, that he teaches us what is right, and that we know, kind of like a kid when they hear, just you wait till your father gets home. There's no fear in that if I didn't do anything wrong, right? But there's a little bit if I did. And yet, his compassion draws us back to him. His compassion is constantly pulling us in, as we sang this morning, that we go deeper still into his love. You know, it reminds me a little bit of a story with my own dad as I think about Father's Day and I celebrate him. And you can see in this picture, that's my brother in the middle. I'm sitting up on the top shelf, and this is my dad over on the left side. And I've been very blessed. I have a compassionate dad, and I just really love him. And there is a lot that he has done in my life that just speaks volumes to me, not only about who he is as a person, but about who he is as a follower of Christ. But one of these kind of funny stories that really drove this home for me is about 10 months ago when my family was moving out here to Cincinnati. You know, one of the things that happens when you move is you realize how much stuff you don't need. So the upright piano, for example, that has 12 keys that stick, and they've been sticking for years, and you can't keep it in tune because the harp inside is cracked, probably don't need to drag that 1,000 pounds across the country, right? Or the couch that I still had from college, because once upon a time it was the most beautiful, most comfortable leather couch you have ever seen or sat on in your life. But duct tape can only hold it together for so long, and I don't really want to drag it up and down another flight of stairs, so these two things have got to go. Well, the garbage man will not come and pick up your piano, so you're going to have to figure it out yourself. So my dad helped me figure this out. The U-Haul truck that was going to get all of our stuff from the Chicago suburbs to Cincinnati was loaded up with the couch and the piano, and I called ahead to make sure that this actually works, right? Oh yeah, all you got to do is, you bring it down here, you back up the truck, and you push it into the dumpster. Push it into the dumpster. Well, I can push. Okay. We show up at the dump. You do not push it into the dumpster. It's a regular dumpster. You would have to lift it almost neck high into the dumpster. That is not happening. I am not lifting an upright piano. And so what happens is, me and my dad have to drive this U-Haul truck down into the landfill. Now, I don't know if you've ever actually been into a landfill. It is terrifying. Because all the way down is like the narrowest of spiral roads made out of nothing but dirt and garbage. And there's guys on Caterpillars and big trucks with huge treads that are flying up and down this thing because they do it 100 times a day. And then there's me and my dad in this U-Haul truck, and I'm looking at our tires. I'm like, we're never going to get out of here again. And I'm like this close to the edge. I'm like, we're just going to topple, and I'm going to die. But we made it to the bottom with my dad at the wheel. And when we get to the bottom, we push the stuff out of the back of the truck. A big Caterpillar comes over with his scoop. He scoops it out of the way. But this is what that kind of drove home for me. Because my dad was with me. Even though this was my junk, even though this was my garbage, my dad got down into that dump with me to help me take care of my garbage, and he drove me back out again. And to me, that is a compassionate father. And that makes me think of the way that God relates to us. You see, it would be one thing for God to look at our lives and say, oh man, things are getting pretty dusty. Your weakness is showing up again. That's your garbage, you figure it out. But he doesn't do that. See, God came down here into our dump, in the flesh, as the God-man, Jesus Christ. He came down into our dump to help us deal with our junk, to take care of our garbage, and to lift us back up. That is what God does for his children, because he has compassion on them, because he remembers who we are. He knows who we are. He knows how we need him at every turn. This is the investment of love that God makes. And whatever your relationship was like with your dad, or what it may be like with your children, you know how investments can be painful. Because you want to love them, you want things to go well for them, you want to give them the best possible life you can, and you know what that looks like. You know how to lay it out so that everything will go smoothly and the family will be happy, but sometimes it just breaks. Either because of our weakness or because of theirs, and love can be painful. And C.S. Lewis has a quote about this in a book titled The Four Loves. And this is what he says about loving other people. He says, "There is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Lock it up in a safe, in a casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable." That's not the relationship that I want with my kids. And that's not the relationship that I want with my God. And that's not the relationship that he wants with us. You see, he wants us to love him, but he doesn't force us to love him. He wants us to respond to his loving fatherhood in our lives. And that's the investment that he makes. You know, sometimes that's painful because as he is our father, there are times that he has to teach us. And that's the second quality of the perfect dad. The perfect dad is a trustworthy teacher. And I love that idea of thinking of God as our teacher. And again, he teaches us because he remembers. Right? He remembers who we are, and because we are his. You know, if a dad came and said, "Well, that's your problem. You deal with it. I don't really care. I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to give you any advice," that would not be a good dad. So if God saw us doing what we want to do, knowing that it was going to hurt us, and said, "Not my problem," then we couldn't call him father, and he wouldn't be the perfect dad. But instead, he teaches us, and he's a trustworthy teacher. So I told you a little bit of a story about my dad. I want to tell you about my dad's dad, too. Because this is something that my grandpa, who you see sitting in the middle there, this is 4 generations of Thorwalds right here. It's my dad on the left, grandpa in the middle, my boys, and my brother. And there's always 3 things that I knew were going to happen when I visit grandpa. Every single time, the same 3 things are going to happen. Number 1, as soon as I walk in, he's going to make the sound of a freight train with his mouth. It's a grandpa thing, I guess. I don't know how he does it, but if you didn't know he was there, you would literally think that there was a train passing by, even if you were out in the middle of the country. I can't do it. I won't even try. But the second thing is that he's going to do a Yogi Bear quote. I don't know why Yogi Bear is like his favorite thing of all time. So every time, "I'm smarter than the average bear, boo-boo." Hey, I love you too, Grandpa. But then the third thing that would happen every single time we came to visit Grandpa. Let me ask you a question. What has the good Lord taught you today that you didn't know yesterday? Every time he would ask this question. Just this incredible assumption that God is a teacher. And that if I've been spending time with God, I must be learning something. Now, as a kid, every time he would ask that, I'd kind of be like, I got to try to think of something real quick, you know? But the fact that he would ask me every time meant that at the very least, if no other time, well, on the way to visit Grandpa, well, I better talk to God for a minute. Let's see, Lord, Grandpa's going to ask me something, so can you teach me real quick? I need something to tell him. You know, but because he just had this core belief that God was a teacher, you know, that began to affect me as his grandson. You know, as it was passed on from my father and my grandfather, that I began to think, I better learn how to relate to God if for no other reason than Grandpa's going to ask me about it. And he just had this incredible sense of God as our teacher. And you know, that comes right out of Scripture. In Psalm 25, the wonderful verse, the psalmist calls on God this way: "Show me your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. I love that. That he craves it from God, that God would teach him. But it's not just God saying, well, here's the manual, go figure it out. It's not just God saying, well, go over there and do that thing and let me know if it works. All right, he says, lead me in your truth and teach me. It's this idea like we have with our own kids. When I think about my son Axel, who has really picked up on baseball, that's like his big thing. And baseball to me is like, I can take it, I can leave it until the Cubs are in the World Series, and then I'm really excited. But he's trying to learn to play baseball, and I'm pitching to him, and he's standing facing the pitcher, swinging the bat like this. Okay, it's not going to work for me to stand on the mound and say, no, do it, no, no. I've got to walk over there. I've got to lead him in this, right? Stand behind him with my hands on his hands around that bat and say, like this, son. Now you try. And I believe that's the way that God teaches us. That he's not a distant God who's just saying, do that. No, that was wrong. No, try this way. No, you're never going to get it. Never mind. But that he leads us. That he comes down into our lives. He says, hold it like this. Swing it like this. I'll show you. I will lead you in my truth. I will teach you. In Proverbs 3, this is fantastic because Craig and I did not collaborate on this, so you're going to love this. Because Proverbs 3 says, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. But I thought Craig said it was Hebrews 12. It is. In fact, there are about 15 times in the Old Testament that talk about God as our Father. There are 165 in the Gospels alone as we get to the New Testament. And through Jesus the Son, we begin to know God more and more and more as our loving Father. And this one is in both places. Written in Proverbs 3, quoted in Hebrews 12. So maybe we should look at it, right? And I think it's important because it says, don't chasten the Lord, don't despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. But isn't that often how we react? I mean, think about your relationship with your own dad. There's times where dad comes home to chasten you. There are times that things have gone wrong, and it's time for some correction. And in our human relationships, sometimes that is done well. That is done from good motives. That is done out of love. That is done because we have the best in mind. Sometimes, honestly, it's the failure of a father. It's done out of anger. It's done out of selfishness. It's done for a lot of different reasons. And whenever it's done, often we push back against that. Don't tell me how to live my life. I'm different than you. I'm not like that. I don't want to be that way. I don't want to do what you say. We resist that kind of authority. But God is the perfect dad. He's a trustworthy teacher because he wants what's best for us, and he knows exactly what that is. So that we can trust him when he teaches us, even when he disciplines us, when he corrects us, even when we don't understand it. Even if we may not know why the things going on around us are going on around us, because we do know that he is trustworthy. And I love what it says here, because in the second half of that verse it says, for whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. So if he didn't love you, he wouldn't bother, but he does love you. And so he does bother, right? Because he remembers that you're dust. He wants to teach you. He wants to make you stronger. He wants to show you, and he always does it from love and delight. Do you think about God that way? A lot of times when we think about God, it's at times easier to drift back to only seeing him as a judge. That God is far distant, somewhere up in the universe, holding lightning bolts because he's ready in case we do something wrong, right? But God says he wants to delight in us, to delight in his sons and his daughters. The way I do after I have that argument with the 2-year-old or the 5-year-old or the 7-year-old, or someday when we have 4 teenagers in the house at the same time, someday when we have 4 kids in college at the same time. But when they go to sleep at the end of the day, whatever you were fighting about and now you see them so peaceful, And you just look at him and say, but man, I love that kid. Man, I love that kid. That's my son. That's my daughter. She's beautiful. I think that's the way that God looks at us. There are times that he knows that for our own good, we need correction. Sometimes that brings consequences. Always that brings compassion. But that he looks at us, and even though that's painful, he's saying, man, I love that kid. Because you are my son. You are my daughter. And here's the thing, the third quality of the perfect dad is that because you're his son, because you're his daughter, the perfect dad brings you into his legacy. The perfect dad wants to give you a legacy worth leaving. And there's a verse in Romans 8:15 that I think captures this really well. It says, "For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father." Now, that word, Abba, is not the Swedish pop group that you're thinking of. That word, Abba, is an Aramaic word that really just means father. But he uses it here because it carries such a heavy, personal, intimate, relational weight. Maybe not quite daddy, but something close to dad. That God wants us to call him Abba, to relate to him that way, to talk to him that way, to understand him as the dad who loves us, who says, I love that kid, who has a hand on our shoulder to lead us the way that he knows is going to benefit us and bless us. And so he adopts us into his family. You see, there's this picture that there is a time when we are outside of his family. And that we don't know him as father, but he adopts us in. And it helps to think about what the Roman adoption was like at that time. And that immediately makes me think of Ben-Hur. I don't know if it makes you think of that, but that's okay. I'll explain it to you. Because if you've seen that movie and if you remember that story, Ben-Hur is a Jew and he's a slave. But everything changes when this wealthy Roman man adopts him. Because then it's not about DNA and bloodlines. It's about who is your father and what is your legacy. And so adoption in the Roman time meant a complete change of fortune, full identification with the father who adopted. In fact, for a real-world example of this, you can look at Emperor Trajan. Trajan was the first non-Roman emperor in the Roman Empire. And the reason for that was because the emperor before him, Nerva, had no heirs. And so as he was nearing death, all of his political opponents are getting really excited. You know, they're gathering up their armies. We're going to battle for this thing. This is our chance to take over the empire. But they were all foiled because Nerva adopted Trajan, who had no other chance at inheriting the kingdom. But through this adoption, he instantly inherited all of the legacy and the kingdom of Rome. You see, this is the picture that the New Testament is using for our adoption. It's permanent, it's total, it's irreversible, it's incontestable, a full identification with God the Father through which we receive not only his legacy, but his inheritance in his kingdom. That we inherit the kind of joy from our Father that lasts regardless of our circumstances. The kind of peace from our Father that rests in our hearts even when it's turmoil all around us. We inherit the kind of forgiveness from our Father that we can pass on as a father. The kind of compassion that goes not only through this life, but an eternal inheritance in the kingdom of God. As I think about legacy, since I told you about my dad, and I told you about his dad, I got to tell you about his dad, my great-grandpa, A.J. Thorwall. And the picture you see of him here is from a biography that my grandpa wrote about him. Now, A.J. died before I was born, and yet I have received a legacy from him. And dads, sitting in the room today, wherever you're at in your dad journey, And whatever that relationship with your kids is like right now, and maybe you are the grandpa now, maybe you are even that great grandpa, you have an opportunity to leave a legacy. And as I think about my own great grandpa, it's kind of amazing the way this happened, because the first part of his legacy is that he is the first Thorwald. In fact, if you ever meet another Thorwald, let me know, because I am related to them in some way. And the reason for that was because originally, the man that you see right there was Axel Torvald Johansson. But he immigrated from Sweden, and when he got here and he came through Ellis Island, they said, okay, you're Axel Johnson now. As the story goes, he looked at the list of names. He said, there are too many Johnsons in this country already. Flip-flopped his middle name with his last name and became Axel Johnson Thorwald. So if you ever meet another Thorwald, he started it. But his legacy is so much more than his name. Now, even though I never met the man, as I've heard about his life, as I've seen the way that he shaped my grandpa, the things that my grandpa learned from him that shaped my dad, the kind of work ethic, the kind of integrity, the faith that he had, is the legacy that he has passed on. Now, think about his work ethic. He was a blacksmith in Sweden. And there are stories about how he could stand and hold his blacksmith's hammer, like a 20, 30-pound hammer, out at arm's length for over half an hour. I do not know where that strength went, but I did not inherit that part of his legacy. But he has passed on to me these character qualities, these character traits. But now there's a question. Will I carry on that legacy? I've inherited it, but what will I do with it? Will I be a man, a father of integrity? A man, a father of kindness, of compassion, of faith? It's possible that you're sitting out here thinking, well, isn't that wonderful for you? 3 generations of wonderful dads and grandpas, and boy, you're just set. But I'll tell you what, every single one of them gets dusty sometimes. Every single one of them has weaknesses. But I believe that the strongest part of the legacy that they have passed down is that in their weakness, they are made strong, not by themselves, but by Christ. And wherever you're at this morning, you may have a legacy from your dad that you don't want to live up to. You don't want to carry on because it's not pretty. But there's no condemnation there. And I don't think you're at a disadvantage. In fact, I would encourage you. All that means is that you're a pioneer. That you can be the first generation of a legacy worth leaving. That God invites you into through Jesus Christ. And it tells us in John chapter 1, in verses 12 and 13, exactly how he does that. Because sometimes we think, hey, we're all God's children. And that may be like the paternity test kind of example, right? He created everybody. But to really be adopted into his family, this is what he tells us. As many as received Jesus, to them he gave the right to become children of God. To those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, not just some paternity test, but born of God through Jesus Christ. It is through the work that Jesus did on the cross to die for us, to forgive us, to empower us to live the kind of life that he teaches us to live, because he's a trustworthy teacher who remembers who we are. That through Jesus, God invites us into his legacy. A total change of fortune, a total identification with the Father. That we might know the Father through the Son and start a legacy worth leaving. So as you go out from here today, whether you're being celebrated, whether you're celebrating someone, whether you're remembering someone, I encourage you, wherever you are, take one more step to know the Father through the Son and start a legacy worth leaving. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you are the perfect dad. Lord, I pray for every heart in here that even today we would just know you a little bit more as Abba. That we would draw a little bit closer, feel your love, feel your delight, feel your compassion a little bit more. Lord, I thank you for this weekend that we get to celebrate the dads in our lives. And Lord, whether that is painful for us or joyful for us, I ask that you would show up, that we might celebrate you this Father's Day. We ask these things in the name of your Son, through whom we know you, Jesus Christ. Amen. Hey, I want to thank you for being here this morning. Dads, I want to thank you for the work that you do. Would all of you just go and have a blessed Father's Day, and we will see you next week. Thanks for coming.